December 7th, 1941 dawned like any other Sunday morning across the Hawaiian Islands. But within hours, the world would witness an attack so devastating that it would transform an isolationist nation into a global superpower bent on vengeance. At precisely 7:55 in the morning, the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft descended upon Pearl Harbor like a swarm of metallic locusts, their engines screaming across the tranquil waters where the United States Pacific Fleet lay anchored, unsuspecting and vulnerable. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the assault, circling above the harbor in his Nakajima B-5N bomber, surveying the target-rich environment below with professional satisfaction. 8 battleships lined Battleship Row like dominoes waiting to fall. The USS Arizona, USS Oklahoma, USS West Virginia, USS California, USS Nevada, USS Maryland, USS Tennessee, and USS Pennsylvania represented American naval might in the Pacific, yet within 2 hours, half would rest on the harbor floor. Seaman First Class James Ward aboard the USS Oklahoma heard the explosions before he understood their meaning. The ship shuddered violently as torpedoes struck her port side in rapid succession. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The massive vessel began listing immediately, her crew scrambling across tilting decks as gravity became their enemy. Within 12 minutes, the Oklahoma capsized completely, trapping over 400 men in her overturned hull. Some would survive for days, tapping desperate messages on the steel plating while rescue crews worked frantically above, knowing that cutting through might flood compartments where sailors still breathed. The USS Arizona suffered an even more catastrophic fate. At approximately 8:10, a modified 16-inch armor-piercing shell, dropped from 10,000 feet by a high-level bomber, penetrated her forward magazine. The resulting explosion lifted the 33,000-ton battleship from the water, broke her back, and created a fireball visible from 20 miles away. 1,177 men died instantly, nearly half of the total casualties that day. The ship settled to the harbor bottom in 9 minutes, taking with her the band that had just finished playing the national anthem for Morning Colors. According to historical accounts documented in Gordon Pranga's comprehensive work, At Dawn We Slept, the attack achieved near-total tactical surprise despite numerous warning signs that American intelligence had failed to synthesize. The disaster killed 2,403 Americans, wounded 1,178 others, destroyed 188 aircraft, and damaged or destroyed 21 ships. Yet amid the devastation lay the seeds of Japan's ultimate defeat. The Pacific Fleet's 3 aircraft carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, were fortuitously absent from port, conducting training exercises and ferry missions. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed Congress the following day, calling December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, America declared war on Japan, ending 2 years of neutrality while Europe burned. The sleeping giant had been awakened, and its rage would reshape the Pacific theater entirely. But the question burning in every American heart was simple and terrifying. Could a nation so bloodied strike back effectively, or had Japan already won the Pacific War? The weeks following Pearl Harbor revealed a strategic nightmare that extended far beyond Hawaii's smoking harbors. Throughout December 1941 and into early 1942, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with terrifying efficiency, executing a coordinated offensive that had been planned for months with meticulous precision. General Douglas MacArthur's forces in the Philippines found themselves besieged, outgunned, and cut off from reinforcement as Japanese troops landed at Lingayen Gulf on December 22nd. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, watched his nation's military machine achieve victory after stunning victory. Guam fell on December 10th after a brief, hopeless defense. Wake Island's Marines held out until December 23rd, inflicting surprising casualties before being overwhelmed. Hong Kong surrendered on Christmas Day. The British fortress of Singapore, supposedly impregnable, capitulated on February 15, 1942. The largest surrender of British-led forces in history, with 80,000 troops marching into captivity. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King assumed command of the United States fleet on December 30th, inheriting a Pacific theater in complete disarray. King, known for his abrasive personality and ruthless efficiency, faced impossible calculations. The Atlantic theater demanded convoy escorts to supply Britain and the Soviet Union. Yet the Pacific required immediate reinforcement to prevent complete Japanese domination. With most battleships sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor, America's naval strategy underwent forced revolution. Aircraft carriers would now lead the fight. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, head of Station Hypo in Hawaii, worked in the basement of the Pearl Harbor Administration Building, leading a team of cryptanalysts racing to break Japanese naval codes. These men and women worked 20-hour shifts, chain-smoking cigarettes and subsisting on coffee, knowing that every message they decoded might prevent another catastrophe. The Japanese used a system called JN-25, an encryption method that combined numerical codes with cipher tables, creating millions of possible combinations. MacArthur's situation in the Philippines deteriorated daily. On January 2, 1942, Japanese forces captured Manila, forcing American and Filipino troops to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur evacuated to Australia on March 11th, and the general departed with his famous promise, "I shall return." Left behind, General Jonathan Wainwright commanded the desperate defense of Bataan and Corregidor Island, knowing surrender was inevitable, but determined to buy time for America to rebuild. The fall of the Dutch East Indies in March 1942 gave Japan control of vital oil fields that had motivated their aggression initially. Japanese forces now controlled territory stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from the Aleutian approaches to Australia's doorstep. Their defensive perimeter encompassed millions of square miles and hundreds of millions of subjugated peoples. To American planners, the situation appeared catastrophic. Yet hidden within this cascade of defeats lay crucial advantages. Japanese forces had advanced so rapidly that they outran their supply lines, spreading naval and air resources thin across an enormous operational area. Yamamoto knew this vulnerability intimately. He argued forcefully for a decisive battle that would destroy America's remaining carrier force before industrial production could tip the balance. His target: a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific that controlled approaches to Hawaii. The atoll's name was Midway, and by spring 1942 Yamamoto was planning the operation that would either win Japan the Pacific War or lose it entirely. While battleships burned and islands fell, the real turning point of the Pacific War was taking shape in a windowless basement, half a world away from combat, where a team of mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts fought a different kind of battle against an enemy who never knew they were engaged. Station Hypo's basement quarters in Pearl Harbor housed 14 officers and enlisted men who would ultimately change history more profoundly than any surface engagement. Commander Joseph Rochefort efficiently embodied this unconventional warrior class. Often working in a smoking jacket and slippers, surviving on catnaps and cigarettes, he possessed both the linguistic brilliance to understand Japanese communication patterns and the intuitive genius to recognize operational intelligence when fragments emerged from statistical noise. His team included Tommy Dyer, a former mathematics instructor who approached code breaking like solving infinite equations, and Jasper Holmes, a submarine officer whose tactical experience helped translate cryptographic fragments into actionable intelligence. The Japanese Navy's JN-25 code system replaced itself every 6 months, resetting the code breaker's work to 0 each time. By spring 1942, Rochefort's team could read roughly 10 to 15% of intercepted messages, frustratingly incomplete, yet occasionally revelatory. They tracked Japanese call signs, analyzed traffic patterns, and noted communication volume changes that suggested operational planning. When certain call signs suddenly went silent, it meant those ships were preparing for combat operations under radio silence. Throughout April and early May 1942, Station Hypo detected alarming patterns. Japanese communication volume increased dramatically. New call signs appeared associated with carrier divisions. Most significantly, an unidentified target designated AF appeared repeatedly in intercepted messages discussing a major operation scheduled for early June. Rochefort believed AF meant Midway, but Washington cryptanalysts disagreed, arguing it indicated Hawaii itself, or possibly the Aleutian Islands to the north. The debate transcended academic interest. American carriers would deploy based on this interpretation, and guessing wrong meant potential annihilation. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, faced the ultimate commander's dilemma. Commit his outnumbered carriers based on incomplete intelligence from basement codebreakers, or maintain defensive dispersal and concede initiative to Japan. Nimitz, a poker player who understood calculated risk, asked Rochefort for confirmation. Rochefort devised an ingenious deception. He had Midway's garrison send an uncoded radio message reporting freshwater distillation equipment failure. Within days, Japanese naval intelligence transmitted an encrypted message noting that AF reported water supply problems. The confirmation was absolute. AF meant Midway. Nimitz now knew where Japan would strike and approximately when, giving America its first genuine advantage since war began. According to the National Security Agency's declassified history, the Battle of Midway, the role of comment in the Battle of Midway, Rochefort's intelligence breakthrough represented one of history's most consequential cryptanalytic achievements, directly enabling the tactical victory that followed. Yet at the time, many senior officers remained skeptical. Naval aviators would fight the battle. Submarines would hunt Japanese ships. Marines would defend the atoll. But codebreakers had given them the irreplaceable gift of foreknowledge. Nimitz began concentrating his available forces. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet were recalled from the South Pacific. The Yorktown, damaged at the Battle of Coral Sea in early May, limped into Pearl Harbor with a hole in her flight deck and flooded compartments. Navy engineers estimated 3 months for proper repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days. Yorktown would sail to meet the Japanese whether fully repaired or not, because Rochefort's intelligence indicated America might never get another chance to fight on anything resembling equal terms. On May 26, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz stood on the pier at Pearl Harbor watching the aircraft carrier USS Yorktown depart for what naval intelligence predicted would be the war's decisive engagement. Welders had worked around the clock, their torches blazing at all hours while repair crews swarmed over the wounded carrier like ants rebuilding their hill. The ship wasn't fully operational. Her damaged compartments had been shored up rather than properly repaired, and some systems remained partially functional. But she could launch aircraft, and that capability made her combat effective enough for desperate circumstances. The Japanese armada, assembling thousands of miles to the west, dwarfed American forces in nearly every measurable category. Admiral Yamamoto commanded the most powerful naval expedition yet assembled in Pacific waters. 11 battleships, including his flagship Yamato, 8 carriers, 23 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and numerous support vessels carrying invasion troops meant to occupy Midway after its defenses were pulverized. The carrier striking force alone, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier and remained Japan's premier weapons. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded this carrier force, and his pilots represented the world's most experienced naval aviators. Many had been flying combat missions since Japan's invasion of China in 1937. They had perfected their craft through years of carrier operations and months of virtually unopposed combat throughout the Pacific. American pilots, by contrast, were often fresh from flight school with minimal carrier experience and no combat exposure. The qualitative advantage lay entirely with Japan, yet Yamamoto's plan contained fatal complexities. Rather than concentrating overwhelming force against Midway, he divided his fleet across multiple objectives. A diversionary force would strike the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention northward. The main carrier force would attack Midway, destroying its air defenses. Battleships and cruisers would then bombard the atoll into submission before invasion forces landed. Meanwhile, Yamamoto's battle line would position itself to intercept American carriers rushing to Midway's defense. Carriers Japanese intelligence believed were in the South Pacific and couldn't arrive in time. Every assumption was wrong. American carriers were already at sea, positioned northeast of Midway based on Rochefort's intelligence. Task Force 16, commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise, and Task Force 17, led by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher on the Yorktown, rendezvoused at Point Luck on June 2nd, 2 days before the expected Japanese attack. Spruance, a cruiser admiral thrust into carrier command when Admiral William Halsey fell ill with shingles, brought intellectual rigor and careful planning to an assignment where aggressive instinct usually prevailed. Fletcher, senior to Spruance, assumed tactical command of both task forces. His orders from Nimitz emphasized calculated risk, inflict maximum damage on Japanese carriers while preserving American flight decks. This wasn't a fight to the last ship. America couldn't afford such Pyrrhic victories. The carriers represented irreplaceable assets until Essex-class ships currently under construction entered service in 1943. Lose these 3 carriers, and Japan would control the Pacific for another year at minimum. On Midway itself, Marine Colonel Harold Shannon commanded approximately 3,000 defenders and knew they faced Japan's full fury. Navy construction battalions, the famous Seabees, had frantically reinforced the atoll's defenses. Anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward from sandbagged emplacements. Coast artillery was positioned to resist invasion forces. Most critically, Midway served as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, housing Army B-17 bombers, Marine fighters and dive bombers, and Navy patrol planes that extended reconnaissance reach hundreds of miles. Lieutenant Howard Ady piloted one such patrol plane, a lumbering PBY Catalina flying boat tasked with dawn reconnaissance on June 3rd. At approximately 9:25 that morning, Ady's crew spotted Japanese transport vessels heading toward Midway from the west, the invasion force exactly where intelligence predicted. The sighting confirmed Rochefort's analysis, but more importantly, it revealed that Japanese carriers weren't yet visible, meaning they would approach from a different vector, likely from the northwest. That night, American sailors throughout the task forces understood battle was imminent. Some wrote final letters home. Others maintained equipment or simply tried to sleep despite jangling nerves. The Japanese, confident in their qualitative superiority and convinced American carriers remained far away, sailed toward Midway expecting relatively easy victory. Dawn on June 4th would reveal how catastrophically wrong those expectations were. June 4th, 1942 arrived under overcast skies that scattered sunlight across the Pacific in broken patterns, creating visibility challenges for pilots on both sides, while the temperature held at a humid 78 degrees where dawn broke at approximately 5:30 across Midway's tiny islands. Lieutenant Howard Ady had landed his PBY Catalina patrol plane just hours earlier, reporting the Japanese invasion convoy, but other patrol aircraft continued their search patterns through the night and into first light. At precisely 5:34, Ensign Jack Reed, piloting another Catalina 30 nautical miles northwest of Midway, spotted what appeared to be a massive formation moving southeast. His radio crackled to life with the most important message of his career: many planes heading Midway bearing 320 distance 150. 7 minutes later, after climbing for better visibility, Reed sent the message every American commander had been waiting for: 2 carriers and battleships bearing 320 distance 180. Aboard the Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo launched his strike wave against Midway at 4:30 that morning, sending 108 aircraft from his 4 carriers to neutralize the atoll's defenses in preparation for the invasion force's arrival. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the attack formation, never suspecting that American carriers lurked beyond his northern horizon. Japanese doctrine assumed battleships remained capital ships requiring protection, so Nagumo kept half his aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs meant for ships, ready to launch against American carriers if they appeared unexpectedly. Midway's radar detected the incoming Japanese strike at 5:53, giving defenders minimal warning. Marine fighters scrambled immediately. 26 Brewster F-2A Buffaloes and Grumman F-4F Wildcats, climbing desperately for altitude against vastly superior Japanese Zeros. Major Floyd Parks led the Marine fighters, knowing his aircraft were outmatched in speed, maneuverability, and climb rate. The subsequent air battle proved one-sided. Japanese fighters destroyed 15 Marine planes while losing only 2 of their own. Tomonaga's bombers pounded Midway's installations despite intense anti-aircraft fire. Fuel tanks exploded in rolling fireballs. Buildings disintegrated under bomb impacts. Yet as smoke cleared, Tominaga recognized the damage was insufficient. He radioed Nagumo at 7 o'clock. "There is need for a second attack." This message would doom the Japanese carrier force. Nagumo, believing no American carriers were nearby, ordered his reserve strike force, currently armed with anti-ship weapons, to be rearmed with land attack bombs for a second Midway strike. Simultaneously, Midway's own strike aircraft launched against the Japanese fleet. Army B-17 bombers, Marine dive bombers, and torpedo planes attacked in uncoordinated waves throughout the morning. None scored hits, and Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire decimated the torpedo bombers. Of 6 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers attacking, 5 were shot down. Of 4 Army B-26 bombers, 2 were destroyed. The Marine dive bomber squadron lost half its aircraft. These brave but futile attacks accomplished nothing beyond confirming to Nagumo that Midway remained dangerous. Then at 7:28, a Japanese reconnaissance float plane from the cruiser Tone, launched late due to mechanical problems, sent a message that changed everything. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships bearing 010 distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo's blood ran cold. American ships weren't supposed to be there. At 7:45, the Tone's plane amended its report. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo faced an impossible dilemma. His flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed from anti-ship to land attack weapons. His first strike wave would return low on fuel within the hour, requiring immediate recovery. Now, enemy carriers, whose exact position and strength remained unclear, threatened from the northeast. Every minute spent rearming aircraft was a minute those American carriers could launch strikes against him. He made a fateful decision: recover the Midway strike force first, then launch a coordinated attack with full strength against the American carriers. It was tactically sound thinking that prioritized proper preparation over hasty action. But it gave the Americans exactly what they needed: time. Admiral Spruance, meanwhile, had made the opposite calculation. Against conventional wisdom suggesting he wait until achieving optimal attack range, Spruance launched everything available at 7 o'clock, accepting that his aircraft would fly at maximum range with minimal fuel reserves. The carrier battle's outcome would hinge on which admiral had guessed correctly. Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 off the USS Hornet shortly after 8 o'clock that morning, commanding 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers that represented obsolete technology facing modern defenses. The Devastator cruised at roughly 115 miles per hour while carrying its torpedo, making it slower than Japanese fighters by more than 200 miles per hour. It possessed no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal armor protection, and defensive armament consisting of a single forward-firing machine gun and one flexible gun operated by the rear-seat radio man. Waldron, a Navy veteran of Part Sioux descent from South Dakota, had argued strenuously with his air group commander the previous night about the attack course. Commander Stanhope Ring insisted they fly the heading calculated by Hornet's navigation team. Waldron believed the Japanese would be farther west. The disagreement revealed deeper tensions aboard the Hornet, where Ring, a non-aviator given command through seniority politics, was distrusted by his pilots. When morning came, Ring led most of the Hornet's air group on his calculated heading. Waldron quietly broke off and flew his own course, the one his instincts told him was correct. At approximately 9:20, Torpedo 8 spotted the Japanese carrier force exactly where Waldron predicted. He waggled his wings and led his squadron toward the attack. Behind him, Enterprise's Torpedo 6 and Yorktown's Torpedo 3 would arrive at intervals over the next 45 minutes, but Waldron couldn't know that. He saw 4 Japanese carriers maneuvering below, surrounded by protective screens of cruisers and destroyers, with dozens of Zero fighters circling above like hawks. What followed constituted suicide. Waldron pressed his attack without fighter escort, without dive bombers to split enemy defenses, with nothing but courage and duty. Japanese Zeros fell upon the slow-moving Devastators like wolves on wounded prey. Anti-aircraft fire from every ship in the formation converged on the torpedo planes. Waldron's aircraft burst into flames and crashed into the Pacific. One after another, the Devastators were blown apart, set ablaze, or simply disintegrated under concentrated fire. Ensign George Gay watched his squadron commander die, then watched his squadron mates die, until his own aircraft shuddered under multiple hits. His gunner, ARM-3C Robert Huntington, was killed instantly. Gay's plane lost power and smashed into the ocean. He surfaced, inflated his life raft, and watched the battle from the water, the only survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. Of 15 aircraft, 15 were destroyed. Of 30 air crew, 29 died. Not a single torpedo hit its target. Enterprise's Torpedo 6 arrived next, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. They attacked without coordination with other squadrons, without fighter protection, facing the same murderous defenses. Of 14 aircraft, 10 were shot down. Lindsay died in the attack. No hits. Yorktown's Torpedo 3 followed, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. Of 12 aircraft, 10 were destroyed. Massey was killed. No hits. In less than an hour, American torpedo squadrons had suffered nearly 80% casualties, while accomplishing nothing measurable in material terms. Yet those sacrifices were not in vain. The torpedo attacks forced Japanese carriers into violent evasive maneuvers, disrupting their attempt to launch a coordinated counterstrike. The Combat Air Patrol, the Zero fighters protecting the fleet, descended to wave-top altitude to destroy the torpedo bombers, leaving high altitude temporarily undefended. Most critically, the attack scattered the Japanese formation and distracted every eye toward the ocean's surface. No one was looking up. On the Japanese carriers, organized chaos reigned. Flight decks were crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed again, this time back to anti-ship weapons after Nagumo definitively confirmed American carriers' presence. Fuel lines snaked across decks. Bombs and torpedoes lay exposed. The Midway Strike Force had been recovered, refueled, and rearmed. Nagumo was perhaps 15 minutes from launching a devastating attack that might have turned the battle. Then at approximately 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bombers, emerged from cloud cover at 14,000 feet and saw the Japanese carrier formation spread below him like a tactical diagram. McCluskey had been flying search patterns for over an hour, running low on fuel, when he spotted a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. He followed its wake, gambling his squadron's fuel reserves that it was rushing to rejoin the main force. He had guessed correctly. McCluskey radioed his dive bomber squadrons and pushed over into his attack dive, targeting the carrier Kaga. His bombs and those of his wingmen struck along Kaga's length, penetrating to the hangar deck where armed and fueled aircraft awaited launch. Secondary explosions rippled through the ship's interior. Within minutes, Kaga was transformed from Japan's premier weapon to a burning wreck. Simultaneously, by sheer coincidence, Yorktown's dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived and dove on the Soryu. 3 direct hits destroyed her flight deck and ignited aviation fuel throughout the ship. The Japanese carrier, which had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, was mortally wounded within 3 minutes. The clock read 10:26 when Lieutenant Richard Best rolled his Douglas SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive toward the Japanese carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo's flagship and the symbolic heart of Japan's carrier striking force. Best commanded Enterprise's Bombing 6, and in the confusion of the attack, only his section of 3 dive bombers targeted Akagi, while McCluskey's remaining aircraft concentrated on Kaga. What happened in the next 5 minutes would reshape the Pacific War's entire trajectory. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi's flight deck near the amidships elevator at precisely 10:26 and 20 seconds. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck where armed Nakajima B-5N bombers sat fully fueled, waiting to launch. The explosion triggered secondary detonations as aviation gasoline ignited and ordnance cooked off. Within seconds, Akagi's hangar transformed into a raging inferno. Damage control parties struggled against spreading fires fed by fuel lines that couldn't be shut off quickly enough. Aboard Kaga, 4 direct hits had already sealed her fate. The forward, middle, and aft sections of the flight deck erupted in flames. Bombs stored on the hangar deck for the aborted second Midway strike detonated in a rolling chain reaction. The entire forward elevator was blown completely off the ship, tumbling end over end before splashing into the Pacific. Captain Jisaku Okada tried desperately to maintain control, but within 20 minutes, fires reached the main aviation fuel tanks. The resulting explosion broke the ship's back. Soryu's destruction proceeded with terrifying speed. 3 hits within 2 minutes, 2 portside amidships, 1 forward, penetrated her relatively thin flight deck and exploded in spaces crowded with armed aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers had executed a textbook attack against a target caught completely unprepared. Soryu's Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto ordered abandoned ship within 20 minutes as fires spread beyond any hope of control. He chose to go down with his vessel, last seen standing on the bridge wrapped in flames. In less than 5 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier striking force had been reduced from 4 operational carriers to 1. 3 of the 4 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor now burned uncontrollably, their crews abandoning ship as explosions continued to rack the dying vessels. The tactical transformation was so sudden and complete that many participants struggled to comprehend what had occurred. Minutes earlier, Japan had held every advantage. Now, they faced catastrophe. Hiryu, positioned farther north than her sister carriers due to maneuvering during the torpedo attacks, remained operational. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding from Hiryu, immediately ordered counterstrikes against the American carriers, whose dive bombers had just devastated his force. At 10:54, 18 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched toward the last reported American position. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the strike, knowing his was likely a one-way mission regardless of the tactical outcome. Meanwhile, American pilots faced their own crisis. McCluskey's dive bombers, having flown extended search patterns before attacking, now calculated fuel reserves for the return flight. Many aircraft couldn't reach their carriers. Some pilots deliberately ditched near destroyers hoping for rescue. Others pushed their engines to maximum economy settings and prayed. Several ran completely dry and splashed down miles from any friendly vessel, leaving crews floating in life rafts hoping someone would find them before sharks or thirst finished what Japanese fighters had begun. Aboard Yorktown, Admiral Fletcher monitored radio reports and assessed the tactical situation. The initial attack had succeeded beyond expectation, but 1 Japanese carrier remained operational, and undoubtedly its aircraft were already inbound. He ordered combat air patrol increased and damage control teams to ready stations. Yorktown had survived 1 battle already at Coral Sea. Her crew hoped their partially repaired ship could survive another. At approximately noon, radar operators detected incoming aircraft. Yorktown's fighter direction officer vectored F-4F Wildcats to intercept, but several Japanese dive bombers penetrated the defensive screen. Kobayashi's aircraft dove through intense anti-aircraft fire and scored 3 hits on Yorktown within minutes. 1 bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded several decks below, starting serious fires. Another struck near the smokestack, rupturing fuel tanks and compromising boilers. The third hit forward, causing flooding that contributed to a developing list. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's official history of United States naval operations in World War II, Yorktown's damage control parties performed near miraculous work, restoring partial operation despite devastating hits. Within 2 hours, engineers had fires contained, restored power, and corrected the list. The carrier was making 17 knots and preparing to recover aircraft when radar detected a second incoming strike. This time, Hiryu had launched 10 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, the classic hammer and anvil approach that divided defensive fire. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, rupturing fuel tanks and flooding fire rooms. The carrier lost all power, began listing severely, and radioed that she was dead in the water. Fletcher transferred his flag to a cruiser and ordered the carrier abandoned if the list couldn't be corrected. Yet even as Yorktown absorbed her death blows, American revenge was already being prepared. Reconnaissance aircraft had located Hiryu, and Enterprise and Hornet prepared strikes to eliminate Japan's last operational carrier in the battle area. Late afternoon sun slanted across the Pacific on June 4th, when 24 Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, spotted the Japanese carrier Hiryu racing northwest at maximum speed, surrounded by her protective screen of cruisers and destroyers. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi had gambled everything on his counterstrikes against Yorktown, and now he would pay the price for that tactical decision. His combat air patrol was depleted, his aircraft were being refueled and rearmed on the flight deck, and American dive bombers were already pushing over into their attack dives. The attack commenced at approximately 5 o'clock. Gallagher led the first section down through moderate anti-aircraft fire, releasing his bomb at 1,500 feet before pulling out violently. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession, 1 forward of the bridge, 1 aft, 2 amidships. The forward hit destroyed the flight deck and ignited fuel lines. The aft hit penetrated to the engine room, destroying critical machinery. Within minutes, Hiryu's ability to conduct flight operations ceased to exist. She was the 4th and final Japanese carrier destroyed that day. Captain Tomeo Kaku fought desperately to save his ship. Damage control parties struggled against fires fed by aviation fuel and exploding ordnance. Engineering crews worked in spaces filling with smoke and superheated steam, but the damage was simply too extensive. By 2 o'clock the following morning, June 5th, Kaku reported to Yamaguchi that the fires were beyond control and recommended abandoning ship. Yamaguchi, who had commanded the carrier division with aggressive brilliance throughout the war, chose to stay aboard. Both he and Kaku remained on the bridge as Hiryu slipped beneath the waves shortly after 9 o'clock on the morning of June 5th. Admiral Yamamoto, positioned hundreds of miles to the west with the battle line he had hoped would destroy American carriers in a surface engagement, received reports of the carrier losses with mounting horror. He initially considered pressing forward, attempting to draw American ships into a night surface battle where Japanese superiority in night fighting tactics might salvage victory from disaster. He ordered the invasion force to reverse course and the battleships to advance eastward, hoping to catch American carriers retreating. But Admiral Spruance, demonstrating the cautious tactical judgment that would characterize his entire career, declined to pursue westward into darkness. He recognized that Japanese battleships vastly outgunned his force and that night engagement favored the more experienced Japanese surface navy. Rather than risk his carriers in circumstances that negated American air superiority, he prudently withdrew eastward, maintaining position to defend Midway while avoiding the trap Yamamoto hoped to spring. Throughout the night of June 4th to 5th, Japanese commanders grappled with unthinkable reality. In a single day, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers and their highly trained air groups, roughly 250 aircraft, and many of Japan's most experienced pilots. The losses couldn't be quickly replaced. Japan's shipyards were already working at capacity, and training new carrier pilots to the proficiency level of those lost would require years the nation didn't have. Yamamoto finally accepted defeat and ordered general withdrawal during the early hours of June 5th. The occupation of Midway was canceled. The invasion force reversed course. The battle line withdrew westward, having never fired their guns at enemy ships. The most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled retreated without achieving any of its objectives. The operational plan that was supposed to trap and destroy American carriers had instead resulted in Japan's most devastating naval defeat. One final tragedy remained. The cruisers Mogami and Mikuma collided while maneuvering during the night withdrawal, severely damaging both vessels. American scout planes located them on June 6th, and dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet attacked throughout the day. Mikuma was sunk after absorbing repeated bomb hits. Mogami, though badly damaged, managed to escape and eventually reached port for repairs. The cruiser kills added salt to already grievous Japanese wounds. Meanwhile, USS Yorktown refused to die. The carrier, abandoned on June 4th, remained stubbornly afloat despite catastrophic damage. On June 5th, a salvage party returned aboard and began working to save the ship. Destroyers took her under tow, heading slowly toward Pearl Harbor. For 2 days, crews labored to keep her afloat, pumping water, fighting residual fires, stabilizing the list. It appeared Yorktown might survive after all, a testament to her builder's craftsmanship and her crew's dedication. Then, on the afternoon of June 6th, Japanese submarine I-168 located the disabled carrier and her escorts. Commander Tanabe Yahachi maneuvered into attack position and fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 struck Yorktown, dooming the wounded carrier despite all efforts to save her. 1 torpedo also struck the destroyer USS Hammond, which was alongside providing power and pumping assistance. Hammond broke in half and sank within 4 minutes, killing 81 men. Yorktown finally capsized and sank the following morning, June 7th, taking with her the physical embodiment of American determination that had fought 2 major carrier battles in a month, despite never being fully repaired from the first. The Battle of Midway was over. The tactical results were clear. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men killed, including many irreplaceable veteran pilots. America lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 men. But the strategic implications reached far beyond the arithmetic of losses. The tremors from Midway's outcome rippled through strategic calculations across both the Pacific theater and the global conflict's interconnected fronts, fundamentally altering assumptions that had governed planning in Tokyo, Washington, London, and Moscow since December 7, 1941. Admiral Yamamoto returned to Japan's home waters aboard the battleship Yamato, his flagship that had never fired its massive 18-inch guns in anger, carrying news of a defeat so complete that Japanese naval leadership initially considered concealing the truth from Emperor Hirohito himself. In Tokyo, the Supreme War Council convened an emergency session during the second week of June 1942 to assess implications of what they euphemistically termed the unfortunate outcome at Midway. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who had led Japan into war confident of achieving a defensive perimeter that would make conquest too costly for America to pursue, now faced uncomfortable arithmetic. Japan's carrier construction program couldn't replace 4 fleet carriers for at least 18 months. The Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of the Coral Sea battle in May, required extensive repairs and aircrew replacement. Japan's frontline carrier strength had effectively been cut in half within 30 days. More critically, the pilot losses proved irreplaceable in any meaningful time frame. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived Midway wounded aboard Akagi, later wrote that Japan lost the cream of our carrier pilots in the battle. These weren't simply trained aviators. They were veterans with thousands of flight hours and combat experience dating back to China in 1937. Japan's pre-war training program had produced superb quality through rigorous selection that graduated only the most exceptional candidates. But that same selective rigor meant the pipeline couldn't quickly produce replacements when losses mounted. The strategic initiative, which Japan had held since Pearl Harbor through sheer operational tempo and tactical excellence, shifted irrevocably to America. Admiral Ernest King, the acerbic commander-in-chief of the United States Fleet, recognized immediately that Midway created opportunities for offensive operations that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Even while shipyards worked frantically to repair Saratoga and bring her back to operational status, King pushed planners to develop options for counter-offensive operations in the South Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding from Australia, had been advocating for a drive northward through New Guinea toward the Philippines since his evacuation from Corregidor. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, preferred a Central Pacific thrust through the Marshall and Caroline Islands toward Japan's inner defensive perimeter. The debate between these approaches, MacArthur's Southwest Pacific strategy versus Nimitz's Central Pacific drive, would shape American operations for the next 3 years. But Midway's outcome made both approaches feasible, whereas before June 4th, both had been theoretical exercises with insufficient resources. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt received news of Midway's victory with relief bordering on euphoria. The American public, battered by 6 months of unrelenting bad news from both Pacific and European theaters, desperately needed evidence that the war was winnable. Roosevelt understood that sustaining public morale through what promised to be a long, grinding conflict required visible success. Midway provided that success while simultaneously validating his decision to maintain a Germany-first strategic priority despite Pacific setbacks. The British government, focused primarily on North Africa, where General Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps threatened Egypt, nonetheless recognized Midway's significance for grand strategy. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who had feared Japan might drive through the Indian Ocean to link up with German forces in the Middle East, could now discount that nightmare scenario. Japan's offensive capability had been blunted. The defensive perimeter they had established from Burma to the Solomons would hold for now, but expansion beyond those boundaries appeared unlikely. According to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after the war, Japanese naval planners recognized within weeks of Midway that the war's trajectory had fundamentally changed. Pre-Midway planning had assumed Japan would defeat American naval forces in one or two decisive engagements, then negotiate peace from a position of strength, keeping conquered territories in exchange for ending the war. Post-Midway planning shifted to defensive operations, aimed at making American reconquest so costly that Washington might still negotiate, rather than pay the blood price for total victory. The psychological impact within the Imperial Japanese Navy proved equally significant. The carrier force had represented Japan's elite striking arm, commanded by officers who had never known defeat and crewed by sailors confident in their qualitative superiority over any opponent. That confidence shattered at Midway. Subsequent operations would be conducted with an undertone of caution, a hesitation to risk remaining carriers in circumstances where they might be lost. This institutional caution would hobbit Japanese naval operations throughout 1943, creating opportunities for American forces to seize initiatives that might otherwise have been contested more vigorously. Conversely, American naval aviators gained immeasurable confidence from Midway's outcome. The battle proved that Japanese carriers could be found, attacked, and destroyed despite their fearsome reputation. The sacrifice of torpedo squadrons, while horrific in casualty terms, had enabled dive bombers to execute the attacks that won the battle. That combination, torpedo planes drawing defenses while dive bombers attacked from altitude, would become doctrine for subsequent carrier engagements. The painful lessons written in blood across Midway's waters informed tactical development for years afterward. Admiral Raymond Spruance emerged from Midway as one of America's most respected carrier commanders, despite having been a cruiser admiral before the battle. His cautious, calculated approach, launching early to achieve surprise, declining night pursuit to avoid Japanese advantages, became the template for effective carrier operations. When Spruance was later promoted to command the Central Pacific Force, his methodology shaped the entire island-hopping campaign that would carry American forces across the Pacific to Japan's doorstep. Yet, perhaps Midway's most profound impact occurred in dimensions beyond naval tactics or strategic planning. The battle represented the first clear American victory of the Pacific War, achieved not through material superiority, but through intelligence, courage, and tactical competence. It validated the decision to prioritize carrier aviation over battleship-centric doctrine. It demonstrated that the massive industrial advantage America would eventually bring to bear mattered little without the tactical skill to employ those resources effectively. Midway proved America could fight and win, despite facing experienced, qualitatively superior opponents. The Japanese Imperial General Headquarters imposed strict censorship on Midway's outcome, preventing accurate reporting of the losses. Families of dead sailors were told their loved ones had died in training accidents. Wounded survivors were quarantined in naval hospitals and forbidden to discuss the battle. This operational security prevented American intelligence from confirming the full extent of damage inflicted, but it also prevented Japanese planners from openly analyzing failures and implementing necessary reforms. The culture of secrecy around Midway's defeat became institutional pathology that hampered adaptation throughout the war. The months following Midway witnessed American forces transitioning from desperate defense to cautious offense, a transformation that would accelerate throughout the remainder of 1942 and into 1943 as industrial production began delivering the tools of victory. On August 7, 1942, just 2 months after Midway, United States Marines stormed ashore at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, initiating a 6-month campaign that would consume both sides' resources in brutal jungle fighting and savage naval engagements. Admiral Yamamoto committed available forces to contesting Guadalcanal, recognizing that losing the southern Solomons would threaten Japan's entire defensive perimeter. The naval battles fought in the waters around Guadalcanal, Savo Island, Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, Santa Cruz, Guadalcanal Naval Battle, Tassafaronga, demonstrated that Japan retained formidable fighting capability despite Midway's losses. In several engagements, Japanese surface forces outfought American ships, sinking multiple cruisers and destroyers while demonstrating superior night fighting capabilities. Yet these tactical victories couldn't compensate for strategic mathematics increasingly favoring America. Essex-class carriers began entering service in late 1942, each displacing 36,000 tons and carrying air groups of nearly 100 aircraft. By war's end, America would commission 17 Essex-class carriers, plus 9 light carriers and dozens of escort carriers. Japan, despite superhuman efforts by her shipyards, would commission only 2 fleet carriers after Midway, the Taiho and the converted battleship carrier Shinano, and would lose both to American submarines before they could significantly impact operations. The pilot shortage that began at Midway metastasized into catastrophic crisis by 1944. Japan attempted to accelerate training programs, reducing flight hour requirements and eliminating advanced combat instruction. The resulting aviators lacked the skill to survive against increasingly experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. The qualitative gap that had favored Japan in 1941 reversed completely by 1943. When the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku sortied for the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, their air groups were slaughtered in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Admiral Yamamoto himself fell victim to the intelligence war he had lost at Midway. American cryptanalysts, continuing the work that had enabled Midway's victory, decrypted messages detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands on April 18, 1943. Admiral Chester Nimitz authorized an assassination mission, and Army Air Force P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport over Bougainville, shooting it down and killing Japan's greatest naval strategist. The architect of Pearl Harbor died because American codebreakers could read his mail, the same intelligence advantage that had doomed his carriers at Midway. The Central Pacific Offensive that Nimitz launched in November 1943 with the invasion of Tarawa demonstrated how completely the strategic balance had shifted. American forces now possessed overwhelming carrier aviation superiority, could bring massive amphibious assault capabilities to bear against island objectives, and sustained operations with logistical infrastructure that Japan couldn't hope to match. The island-hopping campaign rolled westward through the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Marianas, each operation bringing American bomber bases closer to Japan's home islands. By summer 1944, American submarines, aided by the same cryptanalytic capabilities that had won Midway, were systematically destroying Japan's merchant fleet. The oil from the Dutch East Indies that had motivated Japan's initial aggression couldn't reach home islands to fuel the fleet or industry. American submarines sank roughly 1,200 Japanese merchant vessels totaling 5 million tons, 2/3 of Japan's entire merchant marine. The combined fleet, deprived of fuel for training operations, kept increasingly inexperienced pilots in combat while better-trained American aviators hunted them. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval engagement in history, represented the Imperial Japanese Navy's final attempt at decisive battle. They committed virtually every operational warship remaining, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, in a complex operation designed to destroy American invasion forces landing at Leyte in the Philippines. The battle lasted 4 days and ended with crushing Japanese defeat. American forces sank 4 carriers, 3 battleships including Musashi, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force after Leyte Gulf. Historians analyzing the Pacific War's trajectory consistently identify Midway as the campaign's turning point, the moment when Japanese offensive capability peaked and American resurgence began. The 6-month period from Pearl Harbor to Midway saw Japan achieve every objective planners had established. The 6 months from Midway to Guadalcanal's conclusion saw those gains arrested and initial reversals inflicted. The subsequent 2 years witnessed systematic dismantling of Japan's defensive perimeter, accelerating as American material superiority compounded upon itself. Yet Midway's significance transcends operational analysis. The battle represented democracy's answer to totalitarianism's challenge. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor believing that America lacked will to fight a prolonged Pacific War, that a democracy couldn't sustain casualties and privation necessary for total victory. Midway's outcome began disproving that assumption. The subsequent 3 years of island hopping, each operation bloodier than the last, completed the refutation. American forces paid horrific prices at Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, yet sustained operations without wavering. The codebreakers who enabled Midway's victory represented American technological and intellectual advantages that Japan couldn't counter. Joseph Rochefort's team in Station Hypo's basement had given Admiral Nimitz the priceless gift of foreknowledge. Subsequent signals intelligence throughout the war continued providing operational advantages that compounded other American strengths. The tradition of technical excellence in cryptanalysis, established at Midway, continued through the Cold War and into the modern era, validating intelligence community investments that skeptics occasionally questioned. When Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri anchored in Tokyo Bay, the ceremony occurred within sight of where Admiral Perry's Black Ships had forced Japan's opening to Western trade 92 years earlier. The Pacific War had come full circle. A Western power had again demonstrated overwhelming strength to a Japan that had challenged the international order. But the war's outcome had been determined 3 years earlier, in 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks on June 4, 1942, when 3 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded and strategic initiative shifted permanently to America. The men who fought at Midway, those who survived and those who died in the attempt, had turned history's tide without fully comprehending the battle's significance. They had simply done their duty under impossible circumstances, facing overwhelming odds with courage and professionalism. The torpedo pilots who died without scoring hits created opportunities for dive bombers who did. The code breakers who worked in basement obscurity gave commanders intelligence advantages that enabled victory. The engineers who repaired Yorktown in 72 hours sent a wounded carrier to battle one more time. Each contribution, individually small, collectively transformed the Pacific War. Today, the USS Arizona remains submerged at Pearl Harbor, a tomb for 1,177 sailors, and a reminder of war's opening catastrophe. The waters off Midway hold the wrecks of Yorktown, 4 Japanese carriers, and aircraft that carried brave men to their deaths. These silent memorials testify to the generation that fought and won the Pacific War, transforming American defeat into ultimate victory through sacrifice, determination, and competence under fire. The story of Pearl Harbor to Midway represents more than military history. It represents democracy's capacity to absorb devastating attack, regroup, adapt, and ultimately prevail against formidable opponents through courage and capability that authoritarian regimes consistently underestimated. That legacy resonates through subsequent generations, reminding us that free peoples, when challenged, possess resources of spirit that tyrants cannot comprehend until those resources destroy them utterly.